everything without ever mentioning those who had disappeared. The prevailing opinion was that the war was about to end. At about noon, we were brought some soup, one bowl of thick soup for each of us. I was terribly hungry, yet I refused to touch it. I was still the spoiled child of long ago. My father swallowed my ration. We then had a short nap in the shade of the block. That SS officer in the muddy barrack must have been lying. Auschwitz was, after all, a convalescent home. In the afternoon, they made us line up. 3 prisoners brought a table and some medical instruments. We were told to roll up our left sleeves and file past the table. The 3 veteran prisoners, needles in hand, tattooed numbers on our left arms. I became A7713. From then on, I had no other name. At dusk, a roll call. The work commandos had returned. The orchestra played military marches near the camp entrance. Tens of thousands of inmates stood in rows while the SS checked their numbers. After the roll call, the prisoners from all the blocks dispersed looking for friends, relatives, or neighbors among the arrivals of the latest convoy. Days went by. In the mornings, black coffee. At midday, soup. By the 3rd day, I was eagerly eating any kind of soup. At 6 o'clock in the afternoon, roll call, followed by bread with something. At 9 o'clock, bedtime. We had already been in Auschwitz for 8 days. It was after roll call. We stood waiting for the bell announcing its end. Suddenly, I noticed someone passing between the rows. I heard him ask, "Who among you is Wiesel von Sieget?" The person looking for us was a small fellow with spectacles and a wizened face. My father answered, "That's me, Wiesel von Sieget." The fellow's eyes narrowed. He took a long look at my father. "You don't know me? You don't recognize me? I'm your relative, Stein." "Already forgotten? Stein. Stein from Antwerp. Rezo's husband. Your wife was Rezo's aunt. She often wrote to us, and such letters." My father had not recognized him. He must have barely known him, always being up to his neck in communal affairs and not knowledgeable in family matters. He was always elsewhere, lost in thought. Once, a cousin came to see us in Sieget. She had stayed at our house and eaten at our table for 2 weeks before my father noticed her presence for the first time. No, he did not remember Stein. I recognized him right away. I had known Rezo, his wife, before she had left for Belgium. He told us that he had been deported in 1942. He said, "I heard people say that a transport had arrived from your region, and I came to look for you. I thought you might have some news of Rezo and my 2 small boys who stayed in Antwerp." I knew nothing about them. Since 1940, my mother had not received a single letter from them. But I lied. Yes, my mother did hear from them. Rezo is fine, so are the children. He was weeping with joy. He would have liked to stay longer to learn more details, to soak up the good news, but an SS was heading in our direction, and he had to go, telling us that he would come back the next day. The bell announced that we were dismissed. We went to fetch the evening meal, bread and margarine. I was terribly hungry and swallowed my ration on the spot. My father told me, "You mustn't eat all at once. Tomorrow is another day." But seeing that his advice had come too late, and that there was nothing left of my ration, he didn't even start his own. "Me, I'm not hungry," he said. We remained in Auschwitz for 3 weeks. We had nothing to do. We slept a lot, in the afternoon and at night. Our one goal was to avoid the transports, to stay here as long as possible. It wasn't difficult. It was enough never to sign up as a skilled worker. The unskilled were kept until the end. At the start of the 3rd week, our Block Älteste was removed. He was judged too humane. The new one was ferocious, and his aides were veritable monsters. The good days were over. We began to wonder whether it wouldn't be better to let ourselves be chosen for the next transport. Stein, our relative from Antwerp, continued to visit us, and from time to time he would bring a half portion of bread. "Here, this is for you, Eliezer." Every time he came, tears would roll down his icy cheeks. He would often say to my father, "Take care of your son. He is very weak, very dehydrated. Take care of yourselves. You must avoid selection. Eat anything, anytime. Eat all you can. The weak don't last very long around here." And he himself was so thin, so withered, so weak. "The only thing that keeps me alive," he kept saying, "is to know that Liesl and the little ones are still alive. Were it not for them, I would give up." One evening he came to see us, his face radiant. "The transport just arrived from Antwerp. I shall go to see them tomorrow. Surely they will have news." He left. We never saw him again. He had been given the news. The real news. Evenings, as we lay on our cots, we sometimes tried to sing a few Hasidic melodies. Akiba Drummer would break our hearts with his deep, grave voice. Some of the men spoke of God, his mysterious ways, the sins of the Jewish people, and the redemption to come. As for me, I had ceased to pray. I concurred with Job. I was not denying his existence, but I doubted his absolute justice. Akiba Drummer said, "God is testing us. He wants to see whether we are capable of overcoming our base instincts, of killing the Satan within ourselves. We have no right to despair. And if he punishes us mercilessly, it is a sign that he loves us that much more." Hirsch Ginut, well versed in Kabbalah, spoke of the end of the world and the coming of the Messiah. From time to time, in the middle of all that talk, a thought crossed my mind. Where's Mother right now? And Zipporah? "Mother is still a young woman," my father once said. "She must be in a labor camp. And Zipporah, she's a big girl now. She too must be in a camp." How we would have liked to believe that. We pretended. For what if one of us still did believe? All the skilled workers had already been sent to other camps. Only about 100 of us, simple laborers, were left. "Today it's your turn," announced the block secretary. "You are leaving with the next transport." At 10 o'clock, we were handed our daily ration of bread. A dozen or so SS surrounded us. At the gate, the sign proclaimed that work meant freedom. We were counted, and there we were in the countryside, on a sunny road. In the sky, a few small white clouds. We were walking slowly. The guards were in no hurry. We were glad of it. As we were passing through some of the villages, many Germans watched us, showing no surprise. No doubt they had seen quite a few of these processions. On the way, we saw some young German girls. The guards began to tease them. The girls giggled. They allowed themselves to be kissed and tickled, bursting with laughter. They all were laughing, joking, and passing love notes to one another. At least, during all that time, we endured neither shouting nor blows. After 4 hours, we arrived at the new camp, Buna. The iron gate closed behind us. The camp looked as though it had been through an epidemic, empty and dead. Only a few well-dressed inmates were wandering between the blocks. Of course, we first had to pass through the showers. The head of the camp joined us there. He was a stocky man with big shoulders, the neck of a bull, thick lips and curly hair. He gave an impression of kindness. From time to time, a smile would linger in his gray-blue eyes. Our convoy included a few 10- and 12-year-olds. The officer took an interest in them and gave orders to bring them food. We were given new clothing and settled in 2 tents. We were to wait there until we could be incorporated into work commandos. Then we would be assigned to a block. In the evening, the commandos returned from the work yards. Roll call. We began looking for people we knew, asking the veterans which work commandos were the best and which block one should try to enter. All the inmates agreed. Buna is a very good camp. One can hold one's own here. The most important thing is not to be assigned to the construction commando. As if we had a choice. Our tent leader was a German. An assassin's face, fleshy lips, hands resembling a wolf's paws. The camp's food had agreed with him. He could hardly move. He was so fat. Like the head of the camp, he liked children. Immediately after our arrival, he had bread brought for them, some soup and margarine. In fact, this affection was not entirely altruistic. There existed here a veritable traffic of children among homosexuals, I learned later. He told us, "You will stay with me for 3 days in quarantine. Afterward you will go to work. Tomorrow, medical checkup." One of his aides, a tough-looking boy with shifty eyes, came over to me. "Would you like to get into a good commando?" "Of course, but on one condition. I want to stay with my father." "All right," he said. "I can arrange it. For a pittance, your shoes. I'll give you another pair." I refused to give him my shoes. They were all I had left. "I'll also give you a ration of bread with some margarine." He liked my shoes. I would not let him have them. Later they were taken from me anyway, in exchange for nothing that time. The medical checkup took place outside, early in the morning, before 3 doctors seated on a bench. The first hardly examined me. He just asked, "Are you in good health?" Who would have dared to admit the opposite? On the other hand, the dentist seemed more conscientious. He asked me to open my mouth wide. In fact, he was not looking for decay, but for gold teeth. Those who had gold in their mouths were listed by their number. I did have a gold crown. The first 3 days went by quickly. On the 4th day, as we stood in front of our tent, the capos appeared. Each one began to choose the men he liked. You. They pointed their fingers the way one might choose cattle or merchandise. We followed our capo, a young man. He made us halt at the door of the first block near the entrance to the camp. This was the orchestra's block. He motioned us inside. We were surprised. What had we to do with music? The orchestra was playing a military march, always the same. Dozens of commandos were marching off in step to the work yards. The capos were beating the time. Left, right, left, right. SS officers, pen in hand, recorded the number of men leaving. The orchestra continued to play the same march until the last commando had passed. Then the conductor's baton stopped moving and the orchestra fell silent. The capo yelled, "Fall in!" We fell into ranks of 5 with the musicians. We left the camp without music but in step. We still had the march in our ears. Left, right, left, right. We struck up conversations with our neighbors, the musicians. Almost all of them were Jews. Yuliak, a Pole with eyeglasses and a cynical smile in a pale face. Louis, a native of Holland, a well-known violinist. He complained that they would not let him play Beethoven. Jews were not allowed to play German music. Hans, the young man from Berlin, was full of wit. The foreman was a Pole, Franiak, a former student in Warsaw. Yuliak explained to me, "We work in a warehouse of electrical materials not far from here. The work is neither difficult nor dangerous. Only Hidek, the capo, occasionally has fits of madness, and then you'd better stay out of his way." "You are lucky, little fellow," said Hans, smiling. "You fell into a good commando." 10 minutes later, we stood in front of the warehouse. A German employee, a civilian, the Meister, came to meet us. He paid as much attention to us as would a shopkeeper receiving a delivery of old rags. Our comrades were right. The work was not difficult. Sitting on the ground, we counted bolts, bulbs, and various small electrical parts. The capo launched into a lengthy explanation of the importance of this work, warning us that anyone who proved to be lazy would be held accountable. My new comrades reassured me, "Don't worry, he has to say this because of the Meister." There were many Polish civilians here and a few French women as well. The women silently greeted the musicians with their eyes. Franek, the foreman, assigned me to a corner. "Don't kill yourself. There's no hurry. But watch out. Don't let an SS catch you." "Please, sir, I'd like to be near my father." "All right, your father will work here next to you." We were lucky. Two boys came to join our group, Yossi and Tibi, two brothers from Czechoslovakia whose parents had been exterminated in Birkenau. They lived for each other, body and soul. They quickly became my friends. Having once belonged to a Zionist youth organization, they knew countless Hebrew songs, and so we would sometimes hum melodies evoking the gentle waters of the Jordan River and the majestic sanctity of Jerusalem. We also spoke often about Palestine. Their parents, like mine, had not had the courage to sell everything and emigrate while there was still time. We decided that if we were allowed to live until the liberation, we would not stay another day in Europe. We would board the first ship to Haifa. Still lost in his Kabbalistic dreams, Akiba Drummer had discovered a verse from the Bible which, translated into numbers, made it possible for him to predict redemption in the weeks to come. We had left the tents for the musicians' block. We now were entitled to a blanket, a washbowl, and a bar of soap. The Blockiertiste was a German Jew. It was good to have a Jew as your leader. His name was Alphonse, a young man with a startlingly wizened face. He was totally devoted to defending his block. Whenever he could, he would organize a cauldron of soup for the young, for the weak, for all those who dreamed more of an extra portion of food than of liberty. One day, when we had just returned from the warehouse, I was summoned by the block secretary. "A7713? That's me. After your meal, you'll go to see the dentist." "But I don't have a toothache." "After your meal, without fail." I went to the infirmary block. Some 20 prisoners were waiting in line at the entrance. It didn't take long to learn the reason for our summons. Our gold teeth were to be extracted. The dentist, a Jew from Czechoslovakia, had a face not unlike a death mask. When he opened his mouth, one had a ghastly vision of yellow, rotten teeth. Seated in the chair, I asked meekly, "What are you going to do, sir?" "I shall remove your gold crown, that's all," he said, clearly indifferent. I thought of pretending to be sick. "Couldn't you wait a few days, sir? I don't feel well. I have a fever." He wrinkled his brow, thought for a moment, and took my pulse. "All right, son, come back to see me when you feel better. But don't wait for me to call you." I went back to see him a week later. With the same excuse, I still was not feeling better. He did not seem surprised, and I don't know whether he believed me, yet he most likely was pleased that I had come back on my own, as I had promised. He granted me a further delay. A few days after my visit, the dentist's office was shut down. He had been thrown into prison and was about to be hanged. It appeared that he had been dealing in the prisoner's gold teeth for his own benefit. I felt no pity for him. In fact, I was pleased with what was happening to him. My gold crown was safe. It could be useful to me one day, to buy something, some bread or even time to live. At that moment in time, all that mattered to me was my daily bowl of soup, my crust of stale bread. The bread, the soup, those were my entire life. I was nothing but a body, perhaps even less, a famished stomach. The stomach alone was measuring time. In the warehouse, I often worked next to a young French woman. We did not speak. She did not know German, and I did not understand French. I thought she looked Jewish, though she passed for Aryan. She was a forced labor inmate. One day, when Idiak was venting his fury, I happened to cross his path. He threw himself on me like a wild beast, beating me in the chest, on my head, throwing me to the ground, and picking me up again, crushing me with ever more violent blows until I was covered in blood. As I bit my lips in order not to howl with pain, he must have mistaken my silence for defiance, and so he continued to hit me harder and harder. Abruptly, he calmed down and sent me back to work as if nothing had happened. As if we had taken part in a game in which both roles were of equal importance. I dragged myself to my corner. I was aching all over. I felt a cool hand wiping the blood from my forehead. It was the French girl. She was smiling her mournful smile as she slipped me a crust of bread. She looked straight into my eyes. I knew she wanted to talk to me, but that she was paralyzed with fear. She remained like that for some time, and then her face lit up and she said, in almost perfect German, "Bite your lips, little brother. Don't cry. Keep your anger, your hate, for another day, for later. The day will come, but not now. Wait. Clench your teeth and wait." Many years later, in Paris, I sat in the metro, reading my newspaper. Across the aisle, a beautiful woman with dark hair and dreamy eyes. I had seen those eyes before. "Madame, don't you recognize me?" "I don't know you, sir." "In 1944 you were in Poland, in Buna, weren't you?" "Yes, but you worked in a depot, a warehouse for electrical parts." "Yes," she said, looking troubled, and then, after a moment of silence, "Wait, I do remember. Hidek the Capo, the young Jewish boy, your sweet words." We left the metro together and sat down at a cafe terrace. We spent the whole evening reminiscing. Before parting, I said, "May I ask one more question?" "I know what it is. Am I Jewish?" "Yes, I am. From an observant family. During the occupation, I had false papers and passed as Aryan, and that was how I was assigned to a forced labor unit. When they deported me to Germany, I eluded being sent to a concentration camp. At the depot, nobody knew that I spoke German. It would have aroused suspicion. It was imprudent of me to say those few words to you, but I knew that you would not betray me." Another time, we were loading diesel motors onto freight cars, under the supervision of some German soldiers. Hidek was on edge. He had trouble restraining himself. Suddenly, he exploded. The victim, this time, was my father. "You old loafer," he started yelling. "Is this what you call working?" And he began beating him with an iron bar. At first, my father simply doubled over under the blows, but then he seemed to break in two, like an old tree struck by lightning. I had watched it all happening, without moving. I kept silent. In fact, I thought of stealing away in order not to suffer the blows. What's more, if I felt anger at that moment, it was not directed at the capo, but at my father. Why couldn't he have avoided Hidek's wrath? That was what life in a concentration camp had made of me. Fanek, the foreman, one day noticed the gold crown in my mouth. "Let me have your crown, kid." I answered that I could not, because without that crown, I could no longer eat. "For what they give you to eat, kid?" I found another answer. My crown had been listed in the register during the medical checkup. This could mean trouble for us both. "If you don't give me your crown, it'll cost you much more." All of a sudden, this pleasant and intelligent young man had changed. His eyes were shining with greed. I told him that I needed to get my father's advice. "Go ahead, kid, ask. But I want the answer by tomorrow." When I mentioned it to my father, he hesitated. After a long silence, he said, "No, my son, we cannot do this. He will seek revenge. He won't dare, my son." Unfortunately, Fanek knew how to handle this. He knew my weak spot. My father had never served in the military and could not march in step. But here, whenever we moved from one place to another, it was in step. That presented Franek with the opportunity to torment him and, on a daily basis, to thrash him savagely. Left, right, he punched him. Left, right, he slapped him. I decided to give my father lessons in marching in step, in keeping time. We began practicing in front of our block. I would command left, right, and my father would try. The inmates made fun of us. Look at the little officer teaching the old man to march. Hey, little general, how many rations of bread did the old man give you for this? But my father did not make sufficient progress, and the blows continued to rain on him. So, you still don't know how to march in step, you old good-for-nothing? This went on for 2 weeks. It was untenable. We had to give in. That day, Franek burst into savage laughter. I knew it. I knew that I would win, kid. Better late than never, and because you made me wait, it'll also cost you a ration of bread from one of my pals, a famous dentist from Warsaw, to pay him for pulling at your crown. What? My ration of bread so that you can have my crown? Franek smiled. What would you like? That I break your teeth by smashing your face? That evening, in the latrines, the dentist from Warsaw pulled my crown with the help of a rusty spoon. Franek became pleasant again. From time to time, he even gave me extra soup. But it didn't last long. 2 weeks later, all the Poles were transferred to another camp. I lost my crown for nothing. A few days before the Poles left, I had a novel experience. It was on a Sunday morning. Our commando was not required to work that day. Only Edith would not hear of staying in the camp. We had to go to the depot. This sudden enthusiasm for work astonished us. At the depot, Edith entrusted us to Franek, saying, Do what you like, but do something, or else you'll hear from me. And he disappeared. We didn't know what to do. Tired of huddling on the ground, we each took turns strolling through the warehouse in the hope of finding something, a piece of bread, perhaps, that a civilian might have forgotten there. When I reached the back of the building, I heard sounds coming from a small adjoining room. I moved closer and had a glimpse of Edek and a young Polish girl half naked on a straw mat. Now I understood why Edek refused to leave us in the camp. He moved 100 prisoners so that he could copulate with this girl. It struck me as terribly funny, and I burst out laughing. Edek jumped, turned, and saw me while the girl tried to cover her breasts. I wanted to run away, but my feet were nailed to the floor. Edek grabbed me by the throat. Hissing at me, he threatened, Just you wait, kid. You will see what it costs to leave your work. You'll pay for this later. And now go back to your place. A half hour before the usual time to stop work, the capo assembled the entire commando. Roll call. Nobody understood what was going on. A roll call at this hour? Here? Only I knew. The capo made a short speech. An ordinary inmate does not have the right to mix into other people's affairs. One of you does not seem to have understood this point. I shall therefore try to make him understand clearly, once and for all. I felt the sweat running down my back. Hey, 7713! I stepped forward. A crate, he ordered. They brought a crate. Lie down on it, on your belly. I obeyed. I no longer felt anything except the lashes of the whip. 1, 2. He was counting. He took his time between lashes. Only the first really hurt. I heard him count. 10, 11. His voice was calm and reached me as through a thick wall. 23. 2 more, I thought, half unconscious. The capo was waiting. 24. 25. It was over. I had not realized it, but I had fainted. I came to when they doused me with cold water. I was still lying on the crate. In a blur, I could see the wet ground next to me. Then I heard someone yell. It had to be the capo. I began to distinguish what he was shouting. "Stand up!" I must have made some movement to get up, but I felt myself fall back on the crate. How I wanted to get up. "Stand up!" He was yelling even more loudly. If only I could answer him. If only I could tell him that I could not move. But my mouth would not open. At Edek's command, 2 inmates lifted me and led me to him. "Look me in the eye." I looked at him without seeing him. I was thinking of my father. He would be suffering more than I. "Listen to me, you son of a swine," said Edek coldly. "So much for your curiosity. You shall receive 5 times more if you dare tell anyone what you saw. Understood?" I nodded. Once, 10 times, endlessly. As if my head had decided to say yes for all eternity. One Sunday, as half of our group, including my father, was at work, the others, including me, took the opportunity to stay and rest. At around 10 o'clock, the sirens started to go off. Alert! The blockadists had gathered us inside the blocks, while the SS took refuge in the shelters. As it was relatively easy to escape during an alert, the guards left the watchtowers, and the electric current in the barbed wire was cut. The standing order to the SS was to shoot anyone found outside his block. In no time, the camp had the look of an abandoned ship. No living soul in the alleys. Next to the kitchen, 2 cauldrons of hot, steaming soup had been left untended. 2 cauldrons of soup. Smack in the middle of the road, 2 cauldrons of soup with no one to guard them. A royal feast going to waste. Supreme temptation. Hundreds of eyes were looking at them, shining with desire. 2 lambs with hundreds of wolves lying in wait for them. 2 lambs without a shepherd, free for the taking. But who would dare? Fear was greater than hunger. Suddenly we saw the door of Block 37 open slightly. A man appeared, crawling snake-like in the direction of the cauldrons. Hundreds of eyes were watching his every move. Hundreds of men were crawling with him, scraping their bodies with his on the stones. All hearts trembled, but mostly with envy. He was the one who had dared. He reached the first cauldron. Hearts were pounding harder. He had succeeded. Jealousy devoured us, consumed us. We never thought to admire him. Poor hero committing suicide for a ration or 2 or more of soup. In our minds, he was already dead. Lying on the ground near the cauldron, he was trying to lift himself to the cauldron's rim. Either out of weakness or out of fear, he remained there, undoubtedly to muster his strength. At last, he succeeded in pulling himself up to the rim. For a second, he seemed to be looking at himself in the soup, looking for his ghostly reflection there. Then, for no apparent reason, he let out a terrible scream, a death rattle such as I had never heard before, and, with open mouth, thrust his head toward the still steaming liquid. We jumped at the sound of the shot. Falling to the ground, his face stained by the soup, the man writhed a few seconds at the base of the cauldron, and then he was still. That was when we began to hear the planes. Almost at the same moment, the barrack began to shake. "They're bombing the Buna factory," someone shouted. I anxiously thought of my father who was at work, but I was glad, nevertheless, to watch that factory go up in flames. What revenge! While we had heard some talk of German military defeats on the various fronts, we were not sure if they were credible, but today, this was real. We were not afraid, and yet, if a bomb had fallen on the blocks, it would have claimed hundreds of inmates' lives. But we no longer feared death. In any event, not this particular death. Every bomb that hit filled us with joy, gave us renewed confidence. The raid lasted more than 1 hour. If only it could have gone on for 10 times 10 hours. Then Once more there was silence. The last sound of the American plane dissipated in the wind, and there we were in our cemetery. On the horizon we saw a long trail of black smoke. The sirens began to wail again, the end of the alert. Everyone came out of the blocks. We breathed in air filled with fire and smoke, and our eyes shone with hope. A bomb had landed in the middle of the camp, near the upper plots, the assembly point, but had not exploded. We had to dispose of it outside the camp. The head of the camp, the Lagaeltiste, accompanied by his aide and by the chief capo, were on an inspection tour of the camp. The raid had left traces of great fear on his face. In the very center of the camp lay the body of the man with soup stains on his face, the only victim. The cauldrons were carried back to the kitchen. The SS were back at their posts in the watchtowers, behind their machine guns. Intermission was over. An hour later we saw the commandos returning, in step as always. Happily, I caught sight of my father. Several buildings were flattened, he said, but the depot was not touched. In the afternoon, we cheerfully went to clear the ruins. 1 week later, as we returned from work, there in the middle of the camp, in the upper plots, stood a black gallows. We learned that soup would be distributed only after roll call, which lasted longer than usual. The orders were given more harshly than on other days, and there were strange vibrations in the air. "Caps off!" the Lagaeltiste suddenly shouted. 10,000 caps came off at once. "Cover your heads!" 10,000 caps were back on our heads at lightning speed. The camp gate opened. An SS unit appeared and encircled us, 1 SS every 3 paces. The machine guns on the watchtowers were pointed toward the upper plots. "They're expecting trouble," whispered Juliak. 2 SS were headed toward the solitary confinement cell. They came back, the condemned man between them. He was a young boy from Warsaw, an inmate with 3 years in concentration camps behind him. He was tall and strong, a giant compared to me. His back was to the gallows, his face turned toward his judge, the head of the camp. He was pale, but seemed more solemn than frightened. His manacled hands did not tremble. His eyes were coolly assessing the hundreds of SS guards, the thousands of prisoners surrounding him. The Lagaeltiste began to read the verdict, emphasizing every word. "In the name of Reichsfuhrer Himmler, prisoner number Stoll during the air raid, according to the law, prisoner number is condemned to death. Let this be a warning and an example to all prisoners." Nobody moved. I heard the pounding of my heart. The thousands of people who died daily in Auschwitz and Birkenau, in the crematoria, no longer troubled me. But this boy, leaning against his gallows, upset me deeply. "This ceremony, will it be over soon? I'm hungry," whispered Juliak. At a sign of the Lagaeltiste, the Lager Capo stepped up to the condemned youth. He was assisted by 2 prisoners, in exchange for 2 bowls of soup. The Capo wanted to blindfold the youth, but he refused. After what seemed like a long moment, the hangman put the rope around his neck. He was about to signal his aides to pull the chair from under the young man's feet, when the latter shouted in a strong and calm voice, "Long live liberty! My curse on Germany! My curse! My—" The executioner had completed his work. Like a sword, the order cut through the air. "Caps off!" 10,000 prisoners paid their respects. "Cover your heads!" Then the entire camp, block after block, filed past the hanged boy and stared at his extinguished eyes, the tongue hanging from his gaping mouth. The capos forced everyone to look at him squarely in the face. Afterward, we were given permission to go back to our block and have our meal. I remember that on that evening, The soup tasted better than ever. I watched other hangings. I never saw a single victim weep. These withered bodies had long forgotten the bitter taste of tears. Except once. The Oberkappel of the 52nd Cable Commando was a Dutchman, a giant of a man, well over 6 feet. He had some 700 prisoners under his command, and they all loved him like a brother. Nobody had ever endured a blow or even an insult from him. In his service was a young boy, a pipel as they were called. This one had a delicate and beautiful face, an incredible sight in this camp. In Buna, the pipel were hated. They often displayed greater cruelty than their elders. I once saw one of them, a boy of 13, beat his father for not making his bed properly. As the old man quietly wept, the boy was yelling, "If you don't stop crying instantly, I will no longer bring you bread. Understood?" But the Dutchman's little servant was beloved by all. His was the face of an angel in distress. One day the power failed at the central electric plant in Buna. The Gestapo, summoned to inspect the damage, concluded that it was sabotage. They found a trail. It led to the block of the Dutch Oberkappel. And after a search, they found a significant quantity of weapons. The Oberkappel was arrested on the spot. He was tortured for weeks on end in vain. He gave no names. He was transferred to Auschwitz and never heard from again. But his young people remained behind, in solitary confinement. He too was tortured, but he too remained silent. The SS then condemned him to death, him and 2 other inmates who had been found to possess arms. One day, as we returned from work, we saw 3 gallows, 3 black ravens, erected on the upper Platz. Roll call. The SS surrounding us, machine guns aimed at us, the usual ritual. 3 prisoners in chains, and among them, the little pipel, the sad-eyed angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more worried than usual. To hang a child in front of thousands of onlookers was not a small matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was pale, almost calm, but he was biting his lips as he stood in the shadow of the gallows. This time, the Lagerkappel refused to act as executioner. 3 SS took his place. The 3 condemned prisoners together stepped onto the chairs. In unison, the nooses were placed around their necks. "Long live liberty!" shouted the 2 men. But the boy was silent. "Where is merciful God? Where is he?" someone behind me was asking. At the signal, the 3 chairs were tipped over. Total silence in the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. "Caps off!" screamed the Lagerälteste. His voice quivered. As for the rest of us, we were weeping. "Cover your heads!" Then came the march past the victims. The 2 men were no longer alive. Their tongues were hanging out, swollen and bluish. But the 3rd rope was still moving. The child, too light, was still breathing. And so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes. And we were forced to look at him at close range. He was still alive when I passed him. His tongue was still red, his eyes not yet extinguished. Behind me I heard the same man asking, "For God's sake, where is God?" And from within me I heard a voice answer, "Where he is, this is where, hanging here from this gallows." That night, the soup tasted of corpses. The summer was coming to an end. The Jewish year was almost over. On the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the last day of that cursed year, the entire camp was agitated, and every one of us felt the tension. After all, this was a day unlike all others, the last day of the year. The word last had an odd ring to it. What if it really were the last day? The evening meal was distributed, an especially thick soup, but nobody touched it. We wanted to wait until after prayer. On the Appelplatz, surrounded by electrified barbed wire, thousands of Jews, anguish on their faces, gathered in silence. Night was falling rapidly, and more prisoners kept coming from every block, suddenly able to overcome time and space, to will both into submission. What are you, my God? I thought angrily. How do you compare to this stricken mass gathered to affirm to you their faith, their anger, their defiance? What does your grandeur mean, Master of the universe, in the face of all this cowardice, this decay, and this misery? Why do you go on troubling these poor people's wounded minds, their ailing bodies? Some 10,000 men had come to participate in a solemn service, including the Blockältesten, the capos, all bureaucrats in the service of death. Blessed be the Almighty. The voice of the officiating inmate had just become audible. At first I thought it was the wind. Blessed be God's name. Thousands of lips repeated the benediction, bent over like trees in a storm. Blessed be God's name? Why? But why would I bless him? Every fiber in me rebelled. Because he caused thousands of children to burn in his mass graves? Because he kept 6 crematoria working day and night, including Sabbath and the holy days? Because in his great night he had created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, and so many other factories of death? How could I say to him, Blessed be thou, Almighty, Master of the universe, who chose us among all nations to be tortured day and night, to watch as our fathers, our mothers, our brothers end up in the furnaces. Praised be thy holy name, for having chosen us to be slaughtered on thine altar. I listened as the inmate's voice rose. It was powerful, yet broken, amid the weeping, the sobbing, the sighing of the entire congregation. All the earth and universe are God's. He kept pausing, as though he lacked the strength to uncover the meaning beneath the text. The melody was stifled in his throat. And I, the former mystic, was thinking, yes, man is stronger, greater than God. When Adam and Eve deceived you, you chased them from paradise. When you were displeased by Noah's generation, you brought down the flood. When Sodom lost your favor, you caused the heavens to rain down fire and damnation. But look at these men whom you have betrayed, allowing them to be tortured, slaughtered, gassed, and burned. What do? They pray before you. They praise your name. All of creation bears witness to the greatness of God. In days gone by, Rosh Hashanah had dominated my life. I knew that my sins grieved the Almighty, and so I pleaded for forgiveness. In those days, I fully believed that the salvation of the world depended on every one of my deeds, on every one of my prayers. But now I no longer pleaded for anything. I was no longer able to lament. On the contrary, I felt very strong. I was the accuser, God the accused. My eyes had opened, and I was alone, terribly alone, in a world without God, without man, without love or mercy. I was nothing but ashes now, but I felt myself to be stronger than this Almighty to whom my life had been bound for so long. In the midst of these men assembled for prayer, I felt like an observer, a stranger. The service ended with Kaddish. Each of us recited Kaddish for his parents, for his children, and for himself. We remained standing in the apple plots for a long time, unable to detach ourselves from this surreal moment. Then came the time to go to sleep, and slowly the inmates returned to their blocks. I thought I heard them wishing each other a happy new year. I ran to look for my father. At the same time, I was afraid of having to wish him a happy year in which I no longer believed. He was leaning against the wall, bent shoulders sagging as if under a heavy load. I went up to him, took his hand, and kissed it. I felt a tear on my hand. Whose was it? Mine? His? I said nothing, nor did he. Never before had we understood each other so clearly. The sound of the bell brought us back to reality. We had to go to bed. We came back from very far away. I looked up at my father's face, trying to glimpse a smile or something like it on his stricken face. But there was nothing. Not the shadow of an expression. Defeat. Yom Kippur. The Day of Atonement. Should we fast? The question was hotly debated. To fast could mean a more certain, more rapid death. In this place, we were always fasting. It was Yom Kippur year-round. But there were those who said we should fast precisely because it was dangerous to do so. We needed to show God that even here, locked in hell, we were capable of singing his praises. I did not fast. First of all, to please my father, who had forbidden me to do so, and then there was no longer any reason for me to fast. I no longer accepted God's silence. As I swallowed my ration of soup, I turned that act into a symbol of rebellion, of protest against him, and I nibbled on my crust of bread. Deep inside me, I felt a great void opening. The SS offered us a beautiful present for the new year. We had just returned from work. As soon as we passed the camp's entrance, we sensed something out of the ordinary in the air. The roll call was shorter than usual. The evening soup was distributed at great speed, swallowed as quickly. We were anxious. I was no longer in the same block as my father. They had transferred me to another commando, the construction one, where 12 hours a day I hauled heavy slabs of stone. The head of my new block was a German Jew, small with piercing eyes. That evening he announced to us that henceforth no one was allowed to leave the block after the evening soup. A terrible word began to circulate soon thereafter. Selection. We knew what it meant. An SS would examine us. Whenever he found someone extremely frail, a Mussulman was what we called those inmates, he would write down his number, good for the crematorium. After the soup, we gathered between the bunks. The veterans told us, "You're lucky to have been brought here so late. Today, this is paradise compared to what the camp was 2 years ago. Back then, Buna was a veritable hell. No water, no blankets, less soup and bread. At night, we slept almost naked, and the temperature was 30 below. We were collecting corpses by the hundreds every day. Work was very hard. Today, this is a little paradise. The capos back then had orders to kill a certain number of prisoners every day. And every week, selection. A merciless selection. Yes, you are lucky." "Enough. Be quiet," I begged them. "Tell your stories tomorrow or some other day." They burst out laughing. They were not veterans for nothing. "Are you scared? We too were scared. And at that time, for good reason." The old men stayed in their corner, silent, motionless, hunted down creatures. Some were praying. One more hour. Then we would know the verdict, death or reprieve. And my father? I first thought of him now. How would he pass selection? He had aged so much. Our Blockhelters had not been outside a concentration camp since 1933. He had already been through all the slaughterhouses, all the factories of death. Around 9 o'clock, he came to stand in our midst. Achtung! There was instant silence. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. For the first time, his voice quivered. In a few moments, selection will take place. You will have to undress completely. Then you will go, one by one, before the SS doctors. I hope you will all pass. But you must try to increase your chances. Before you go into the next room, try to move your limbs, give yourself some color. Don't walk slowly, run. Run as if you had the devil at your heels. Don't look at the SS. Run straight in front of you. He paused and then added, and most important, don't be afraid. That was a piece of advice we would have loved to be able to follow. I undressed, leaving my clothes on my cot. Tonight there was no danger that they would be stolen. Tibi and Yossi, who had changed commandos at the same time I did, came to urge me. Let's stay together, it'll make us stronger. Yossi was mumbling something. He probably was praying. I had never suspected that Yossi was religious. In fact, I had always believed the opposite. Tibi was silent and very pale. All the block inmates stood naked between the rows of bunks. This must be how one stands for the last judgment. They are coming. 3 SS officers surrounded the notorious Dr. Mengele, the very same who had received us in Birkenau. The Blockälteste attempted a smile. He asked us, ready? Yes, we were ready. So were the SS doctors. Dr. Mengele was holding a list, our numbers. He nodded to the Blockälteste. We can begin, as if this were a game. The first to go were the notables of the block, the Stubenälteste, the capos, the foremen, all of whom were in perfect physical condition, of course. Then came the ordinary prisoners' turns. Dr. Mengele looked them over from head to toe. From time to time he noted a number. I had but one thought, not to have my number taken down and not to show my left arm. In front of me there were only Tibi and Yossi. They passed. I had time to notice that Mengele had not written down their numbers. Someone pushed me. It was my turn. I ran without looking back. My head was spinning. You're too skinny. You're too weak. You're too skinny. You are good for the ovens. The race seemed endless. I felt as though I had been running for years. You're too skinny. You're too weak. At last I arrived, exhausted. When I had caught my breath, I asked Yossi and Tibi, did he write me down? No, said Yossi. Smiling, he added, anyway, they couldn't have. You were running too fast. I began to laugh. I was happy. I felt like kissing him. At that moment, the others did not matter. They had not written me down. Those whose numbers had been noted were standing apart, abandoned by the whole world. Some were silently weeping. The SS officers left. The Blockälteste appeared, his face reflecting our collective weariness. It all went well. Don't worry. Nothing will happen to anyone. Not to anyone. He was still trying to smile. A poor, emaciated Jew questioned him anxiously, his voice trembling. But, sir, they did write me down. At that, the Blockälteste vented his anger. What, someone refused to take his word? What is it now? Perhaps you think I'm lying? I'm telling you once and for all, nothing will happen to you. Nothing. You just like to wallow in your despair, you fools. The bell rang, signaling that the selection had ended in the entire camp. With all my strength, I began to race toward Block 36. Midway, I met my father. He came toward me. So, did you pass? Yes, and you? Also. We were able to breathe again. My father had a present for me. A half ration of bread, bartered for something he had found at the depot, a piece of rubber that could be used to repair a shoe. The bell. It was already time to part, to go to bed. The bell regulated everything. It gave me orders, and I executed them blindly. I hated that bell. Whenever I happened to dream of a better world, I imagined a universe without a bell. A few days passed. We were no longer thinking about the selection. We went to work as usual and loaded the heavy stones onto the freight cars. The rations had grown smaller. That was the only change. We had risen at dawn, as we did every day. We had received our black coffee, our ration of bread. We were about to head to the workyard, as always. The blockautosta came running. "Let's have a moment of quiet. I have here a list of numbers. I shall read them to you. All those called will not go to work this morning. They will stay in camp." Softly, he read some 10 numbers. We understood. These were the numbers from the selection. Dr. Mengele had not forgotten. The blockautosta turned to go to his room. The 10 prisoners surrounded him, clinging to his clothes. "Save us! You promised! We want to go to the depot. We are strong enough to work. We are good workers. We want..." He tried to calm them, to reassure them about their fate, to explain to them that staying in the camp did not mean much, had no tragic significance. Why? The argument was more than flimsy. He realized it, and, without another word, locked himself in his room. The bell had just rung. "Form ranks!" Now, it no longer mattered that the work was hard. Ought be far from the block, far from the crucible of death, from the center of hell. I saw my father running in my direction. Suddenly, I was afraid. "What is happening?" He was out of breath, hardly able to open his mouth. Me too. They told me to stay in the camp." They had recorded his number without his noticing. "What are we going to do?" I said anxiously. But it was he who tried to reassure me. "It's not certain yet. There's still a chance. Today they will do another selection, a decisive one." I said nothing. He felt time was running out. He was speaking rapidly. He wanted to tell me so many things. His speech became confused. His voice was choked. He knew that I had to leave in a few moments. He was going to remain alone. So alone. "Here, take this knife," he said. "I won't need it anymore. You may find it useful. Also, take this spoon. Don't sell it. Quickly, go ahead, take what I'm giving you." My inheritance. "Don't talk like that, Father." I was on the verge of breaking into sobs. "I don't want you to say such things. Keep the spoon and knife. You will need them as much as I. We'll see each other tonight after work." He looked at me with his tired eyes. Veiled by despair, he insisted, "I am asking you. Take it. Do as I ask you, my son. Time is running out. Do as your father asks you." Our capo shouted the orders to march. The commando headed toward the camp gate. Left, right. I was biting my lips. My father had remained near the block, leaning against the wall. Then he began to run, to try to catch up with us. Perhaps he had forgotten to tell me something, but we were marching too fast. Left, right. We were at the gate. We were being counted. Around us, the din of military music. Then we were outside. All day, I plodded around like a sleepwalker. Tibi and Yossi would call out to me from time to time, trying to reassure me, as did the capo who had given me easier tasks that day. I felt sick at heart. How kindly they treated me, like an orphan. I thought, even now my father is helping me. I myself didn't know whether I wanted the day to go by quickly or not. I was afraid of finding myself alone that evening. How good it would be to die right here. At last we began the return journey. How I longed for an order to run. The military march, the gate, the camp, I ran toward Block 36. Were there still miracles on this earth? He was alive. He had passed the second selection. He had still proved his usefulness. I gave him back his knife and spoon. Akiva Drummer has left us, a victim of the selection. Lately, he had been wandering among us, his eyes glazed, telling everyone how weak he was. I can't go on. It's over. We tried to raise his spirits, but he wouldn't listen to anything we said. He just kept repeating that it was all over for him, that he could no longer fight. He had no more strength, no more faith. His eyes would suddenly go blank, leaving two gaping wounds, two wells of terror. He was not alone in having lost his faith during those days of selection. I knew a rabbi from a small town in Poland. He was old and bent, his lips constantly trembling. He was always praying, in the block, at work, in the ranks. He recited entire pages from the Talmud, arguing with himself, asking and answering himself endless questions. One day he said to me, "It's over. God is no longer with us." And as though he regretted having uttered such words so coldly, so dryly, he added in his broken voice, "I know. No one has the right to say things like that. I know that very well. Man is too insignificant, too limited, to even try to comprehend God's mysterious ways. But what can someone like myself do? I'm neither a sage nor a just man. I am not a saint. I'm a simple creature of flesh and bone. I suffer hell in my soul and my flesh. I also have eyes, and I see what is being done here. Where is God's mercy? Where is God? How can I believe? How can anyone believe in this God of mercy?" Poor Akiva Drummer. If only he could have kept his faith in God. If only he could have considered this suffering a divine test, he would not have been swept away by the selection. But as soon as he felt the first chinks in his faith, he lost all incentive to fight and opened the door to death. When the selection came, he was doomed from the start, offering his neck to the executioner, as it were. All he asked of us was, "In 3 days I'll be gone. Say Kaddish for me." We promised. In 3 days, when we would see the smoke rising from the chimney, we would think of him. We would gather 10 men and hold a special service. All his friends would say Kaddish. Then he left in the direction of the hospital. His step was almost steady, and he never looked back. An ambulance was waiting to take him to Birkenau. There followed terrible days. We received more blows than food. The work was crushing. And 3 days after he left, we forgot to say Kaddish. Winter had arrived. The days became short and the nights almost unbearable. From the first hours of dawn, a glacial wind lashed us like a whip. We were handed winter clothing, striped shirts that were a bit heavier. The veterans grabbed the opportunity for further sniggering. "Now you'll really get a taste of camp." We went off to work as usual, our bodies frozen. The stones were so cold that touching them we thought that our hands would remain stuck. But we got used to that too. Christmas and New Year's we did not work. We were treated to a slightly less transparent soup. Around the middle of January, my right foot began to swell from the cold. I could not stand on it. I went to the infirmary. The doctor, a great Jewish doctor, a prisoner like ourselves, was categorical. "We have to operate. If we wait, the toes and perhaps the leg will have to be amputated." That was all I needed. But I had no choice. The doctor had decided to operate, and there could be no discussion. In fact, I was rather glad that the decision had been his. They put me in a bed with white sheets. I had forgotten that people slept in sheets. Actually, being in the infirmary was not bad at all. We were entitled to good bread, a thicker soup. No more bell, no more roll call, no more work. From time to time, I was able to send a piece of bread to my father. Next to me lay a Hungarian Jew suffering from dysentery. He was skin and bones. His eyes were dead. I could just hear his voice, the only indication that he was alive. Where did he get the strength to speak? Don't rejoice too soon, son. Here too there is selection. In fact, more often than outside. Germany has no need of sick Jews. Germany has no need of me. When the next transport arrives, you'll have a new neighbor. Therefore, listen to me. Leave the infirmary before the next selection. These words, coming from the grave, as it were, from a faceless shape, filled me with terror. True, the infirmary was very small, and if new patients were to arrive, room would have to be made. But then, perhaps my faceless neighbor, afraid of being among the first displaced, simply wanted to get rid of me, to free my bed, to give himself a chance to survive. Perhaps he only wanted to frighten me. But then again, what if he was telling the truth? I decided to wait and see. The doctor came to tell me that he would operate the next day. Don't be afraid, he said. Everything will be all right. At 10 o'clock in the morning, I was taken to the operating room. My doctor was there. That reassured me. I felt that in his presence, nothing serious could happen to me. Every one of his words was healing, and every glance of his carried a message of hope. It will hurt a little, he said, but it will pass. Be brave. The operation lasted 1 hour. They did not put me to sleep. I did not take my eyes off my doctor. Then I felt myself sink. When I came to and opened my eyes, I first saw nothing but a huge expanse of white, my sheets. Then I saw my doctor's face above me. Everything went well. You have spunk, my boy. Next, you'll stay here 2 weeks for some proper rest, and that will be it. You'll eat well, you'll relax your body and your nerves. All I could do was follow the movements of his lips. I barely understood what he was telling me, but the inflection of his voice soothed me. Suddenly, I broke into a cold sweat. I couldn't feel my leg. Had they amputated it? Doctor, I stammered. Doctor? What is it, son? I didn't have the courage to ask him. Doctor, I'm thirsty. He had water brought to me. He was smiling. He was ready to walk out to see other patients. Doctor? Yes. Will I be able to use my leg? He stopped smiling. I became very frightened. He said, Listen, son, do you trust me? Very much, doctor. Then listen well. In 2 weeks you'll be fully recovered. You'll be able to walk like the others. The sole of your foot was full of pus. I just had to open the sac. Your leg was not amputated. You'll see, in 2 weeks, you'll be walking around like everybody else. All I had to do was wait 2 weeks. But 2 days after my operation, rumors swept through the camp that the battlefront had suddenly drawn nearer. The Red Army was racing toward Buna. It was only a matter of hours. We were quite used to this kind of rumor. It wasn't the first time that false prophets announced to us peace in the world, the Red Cross negotiating our liberation, or other fables. And often we would believe them. It was like an injection of morphine. Only this time these prophecies seemed more founded. During the last nights we had heard the cannons in the distance. My faceless neighbor spoke up. Don't be deluded. Hitler has made it clear that he will annihilate all Jews before the clock strikes 12. I exploded. What do you care what he said? Would you want us to consider him a prophet? His cold eyes stared at me. At last he said wearily, I have more faith in Hitler than in anyone else. He alone has kept his promises, all his promises. to the Jewish people. That afternoon at 4 o'clock, as usual, the bell called all the Blockälteste for their daily report. They came back shattered. They had difficulty opening their mouths. All they could utter was one word: evacuation. The camp was going to be emptied, and we would be sent to the rear. Where to? Somewhere in deepest Germany, to other camps. There was no shortage of them. When? Tomorrow night. Perhaps the Russians will arrive before. Perhaps. We knew perfectly well they would not. The camp had become a hive of activity. People were running, calling to one another. In every block, the inmates prepared for the journey ahead. I had forgotten about my lame foot. A doctor came into the room and announced, "Tomorrow, right after nightfall, the camp will start on its march, block by block. The sick can remain in the infirmary. They will not be evacuated." That news made us wonder. Were the SS really going to leave hundreds of prisoners behind in the infirmaries, pending the arrival of their liberators? Were they really going to allow Jews to hear the clock strike 12? Of course not. "All the patients will be finished off on the spot," said the faceless one, and in one last swoop, thrown into the furnaces. "Surely the camp will be mined," said another. "Right after the evacuation, it will all blow up." As for me, I was thinking not about death, but about not wanting to be separated from my father. We had already suffered so much, endured so much together. This was not the moment to separate. I ran outside to look for him. The snow was piled high, the block's windows veiled in frost. Holding a shoe in my hand, for I could not put it on my right foot, I ran, feeling neither pain nor cold. "What are we going to do?" My father didn't answer. "What are we going to do?" He was lost in thought. The choice was in our hands. For once, we could decide our fate for ourselves, to stay, both of us, in the infirmary where, thanks to my doctor, he could enter as either a patient or a medic. I had made up my mind to accompany my father wherever he went. "Well, Father, what do we do?" He was silent. "Let's be evacuated with the others," I said. He didn't answer. He was looking at my foot. "You think you'll be able to walk?" "Yes, I think so." "Let's hope we won't regret it, Eliezer." After the war, I learned the fate of those who had remained at the infirmary. They were quite simply liberated by the Russians 2 days after the evacuation. I did not return to the infirmary. I went straight to my block. My wound had reopened and was bleeding. The snow under my feet turned red. The Blockälteste had distributed double rations of bread and margarine for the road. We could take as much clothing from the store as we wanted. It was cold. We got into our bunks. The last night in Buna. Once more, the last night. The last night at home. The last night in the ghetto. The last night in the cattle car, and now, the last night in Buna. How much longer would our lives be lived from one last night to the next? I didn't sleep. Through the frosty window panes, we could see flashes of red. Cannon shots broke the silence of night. How close the Russians were. Between them and us, one night, our last. There was whispering from one bunk to the other. With a little luck, the Russians would be here before the evacuation. Hope was still alive. Someone called out, "Try to sleep. Gather your strength for the journey." It reminded me of my mother's last recommendations in the ghetto. But I couldn't fall asleep. My foot was on fire. In the morning, the camp did not look the same. The prisoners showed up in all kinds of strange garb. It looked like a masquerade. We each had put on several garments, one over the other, to better protect ourselves from the cold. Poor clowns, wider